So, today we're going to talk about the Seneca Falls Convention. Anybody know right off the bat what that is? What that was?
I remember hearing about it, but I can't remember. I remember it vaguely.
Okay, that's fine. So, on July 19th, 1848, in front of the Seneca Falls Convention, these words were read. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. What's that from? Anybody know?
Is that from the
Constitution?
The Constitution?
Close. It's
The Declaration of Independence.
Declaration.
It's very close to being from the Declaration of Independence. There's one important difference in this block of text that's not, there's one phrase in this block of text that's not in the Declaration of Independence. Can anybody point it out?
Women.
Women, that's right. This is actually from a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which was released in, which was read out in front of a convention in 1848. And that convention was the Seneca Falls Convention, which was a convention whose purpose, let me get this right and make sure I quote it correctly, a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. Okay, so let's talk about that for a little while. Women had started thinking the same kinds of things that men were thinking during the Enlightenment. As the Enlightenment was sweeping through and social scientists were asking questions about the state of society, women were asking questions about the state of women, the rights of women, the role of women, all of those kinds of things. So you have Enlightenment thinkers among women at the same time that you have John Locke and Thomas Jefferson and all of them. You have women who are also publishing new ideas, examining society from the perspective of how it treats women. Probably the most famous of this was Mary Wollstonecraft, who published a book called The Vindication of the Rights of Women. And that was in 1792, so right after the American Revolutionary War. While, for example, George Washington was still in office, you know, the first president was still in office, over in England, Mary Wollstonecraft was publishing this book. And inside this book is an examination of how women are civilly killed when they get married, that they become non-entities, and that that needs to change because women are a valuable asset to society. They bring their brains with them, they bring their abilities, and the rights of women should be, the right of a woman to make choices about her own life should be something that is protected. At the time, most people received what Mary Wollstonecraft published as, oh, that's sweet. I like that, that's nice, but didn't take it very seriously. Women can read whatever they want to. It's just not going to change society. It wasn't until after her death and somebody wrote a biography about her that people began to treat the Vindication of the Rights of Women like it was some kind of evil book that only badly behaved women ever had in their libraries. And don't quote Mary Wollstonecraft to me, you know, it was something that, you know, you only see in movies that are made about that time that don't really reflect what was happening at that time. But it is true that her ideas were kind of revolutionary. The idea of women, if you think that you have what it takes to become a physician, you should be allowed to study the medical sciences. If you think you have what it takes to be an astronomer, you should be allowed to study the science of astronomy because you have the capacity to do so. So why can't you? And if the only reason is because you're a woman, then there's a problem with that. Because the whole world was kind of engaged in practices of what we call coverture. Coverture is the legal framework that makes it so that as soon as you become a married woman, everything that you are comes under the purview of your husband's identity. Do we still do that? What do you think? I'm going to tell you about a conversation that I overheard. I had a conversation with, and I'm not going to say who they were, but I was listening to a couple of professors complain about the fact that the night before at a faculty mixer, one of them had said, Dr. and Mrs. about a couple that was there. And the husband of that couple turned around and said, actually, it's doctor and doctor. And the professors were complaining because they didn't think that that was important. Okay, so the wife was also a doctor. We'll call them Smith. They were introduced as Dr. and Mrs. Smith, and the male, Mr. Smith, turned around and said, actually, it's Dr. and Dr. Smith, because we're actually both doctors. We both actually have doctorates. And the person that was having this conversation said, I felt really called out, and I don't see why that was necessary. Is it disrespectful to call her Mrs. Smith? What do y'all think?
Isn't it that argument about calling Jill Biden doctor too?
This was not about that, but that's a good point. We have President and Dr. Biden in the White House now. President Biden is not a doctorate. He doesn't hold a doctorate in anything, but he is President Biden. But his wife is Dr. Biden because she has a doctorate in educational sciences. But the tradition would be to call her Mrs. Biden. So do we still do that? Do we still hand our identities over when we get married?
I feel like it's not supposed to happen, but it does.
Right. I think we've edged further and further into the direction of that. But I think that there is still the fact that women still lose their last names when they get married and change their last name to whatever their husband's name is so that people can refer to them as Mr. and Mrs. his last name is an indication that coverture is still something we practice a little bit. But it used to be much more severe. It used to be that as soon as you were married, all of your property, all of your ability to earn property, all of your wages, if you worked, then wages that you earned, all of your legal status and all of your fights belonged to your husband. And when I say all of your fights, that means if somebody attacked you and assaulted you, the lawsuit would be against a loss that he suffered, not against a loss that you suffered. In other words, if somebody damaged your personal property, your husband could sue for damage to his personal property, but you couldn't as his wife, because everything that you have belongs to him. So it is now all under his name. And the reason for this is, of course, because the world was set up to recognize family units, not individuals. Okay, the world was set up to recognize property units, not individuals. So I have some graphics here to kind of show you this is the life. This is the life of a woman from cradle to the grave, and this is a woodcut picture from a publication saying this is happiness right here. This is a woman who is married and has handed everything over to her husband, and this is the joy that she has to look forward to in being married. Coverture is the legal doctrines that make it so that a husband can assume everything that is the identity of a wife. Now, there is this wave of new ideologies that had swept through, and we talked about them a little bit, we talked about them a little bit on Wednesday. We talked about transcendentalism. Y'all remember talking about transcendentalism? The idea of examining the world and trying to be the best possible version of yourself actually sweeps through a lot of these kinds of societies. It really takes its root from this group of people here. The Quakers have been in America since the 1600s. They founded Pennsylvania. The Quakers are a group of a religious order, a religious group that was founded in England in the early 1600s of people who believed that they needed to get rid of all of this ritual and all of this hierarchy, but they also needed to stop. They're not like the Puritans where they need to forcefully drive it out. It's all about a personal relationship and a personal interaction with God. And then if you set that aside, then you can just hear the voice of God inside you. And the reason they're called Quakers is because they would sit around and bring themselves into a state of basically meditation and try to hear the voice of God. And if they did start to hear the voice of God, they would shake and cry out and wail and make a lot of noise. And so they were called Quakers.
They were the weird people in the woods.
Yeah, often. Although not to be confused with witches, but during our witch hunt, there was a family of Quakers in the woods that didn't come up during any of the evidence because whoever it was that had that piece never said anything about it. But the Quaker society entered a period of what's called quietism, where they stopped making a lot of noise when they were, and now they just do this like quiet Zen meditation kind of thing in order to commune with God. But at the core of being a Quaker is the idea that you have to fix society. It's your job to make society better by your presence, leave it better than you found it. And so Quakers get involved in things like Native American relations. As soon as they come to America, they begin trying to figure out how to treat the Native Americans better. As they grow in America, they really start to take their focuses on abolitionism. They start to focus on setting slaves free. Pennsylvania is the first state where it's illegal to hold slaves. And it is Quakers that begin the Underground Railroad, that begin opening up pathways to freedom for the slaves. So it kind of starts there. Margaret Fuller was a Quaker, an extremely well-educated Quaker. She managed to attend every university, every level of school that was available to women, and a couple that weren't. She was one of the few people that was ever given access to the Harvard Library, even though she was a woman. And she became a writer for the New York Tribune, and she became a war correspondent for the New York Tribune. And then she became one of the first editors that was a woman of the New York Tribune. And in 1839, she started to offer, you remember when we were talking about the Enlightenment, we talked about people having salons, places where they had like, you know, people would gather and talk about new ideas and old philosophies and how they fit together. She started having those specifically to provide extra education for women and to talk about the status of women. And the Quakers really took that and started to run with it. So we have people like William Lloyd Garrison, who was a Quaker, who started the Anti-Slavery Society, one of the first anti-slavery societies that allowed women to participate. There were anti-slavery societies that were started by Quakers all over the place, but William Lloyd Garrison started the first one that allowed women to be a part of the structure of the organization. He believed that it would be useful to have women also help free slaves. They brought gifts with them as well. And he was one of the loudest voices against slavery. He was not a manumissionist. He was a 100% set them all free. It was wrong of us to ever enslave them to begin with. Enslave the liberty of but one human being, and the liberties of the world are put in peril. What year was William Lloyd Garrison? What year did he start the 1832? So we're in 1832 at this point. In answer to your question, Alexa. Okay, so Lucretia Mott was a Quaker minister, and she was a part of William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery organization. He was one of the, like I said, he was one of the only ones that allowed women to be a part of it. And so he allowed her not only to be a part of it, but also to preach, to lecture, to offer talks. And she was such a gifted speaker that people would come from a really long way to hear her speak. She would get up in front of the anti-slavery organizations, and she would give these talks about the life of slaves, and why it should be. She also had a lot of other movements that she was part of. She was part of the temperance movement, which was trying to back down the use of alcohol in families. She was also part of what's called the free produce movement, which is boycott against all products that are harvested by slaves. So that, you know, if the plantation owners felt the sting of a boycott, then maybe they would stop using slaves to grow and produce their plants. So she was part of what was called the free produce movement. She made a friend in the early 1830s by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was born into a family of extremely educated people. Her father, Daniel Cady, was a Supreme Court justice eventually. He became a Supreme Court justice. And under him, she studied Greek, mathematics, horsemanship, philosophy. She won awards for debate, and she studied the law. She got all of the education necessary for the law, but was not permitted to practice it because she was a woman. So instead, she married a lawyer, and she helped him in his law practice, Henry Stanton. And with her lawyer husband, she had 7 children. But she was universally recognized as a really brilliant person. She was extremely articulate. She was able to deliver public speeches. This, like Lucretia Mott, she was able to get up and speak publicly. And some of her ideas were based in an education that was just not available to other women. She became friends with Lucretia Mott, and the two of them began to attend anti-slavery conventions together. As a matter of fact, William Lloyd Garrison convinced them to attend what was basically in 1840 the first anti-slavery convention. And he convinced Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to go to that. And when they arrived, they found out that they weren't welcome there. Okay, take a look at this picture. This is the convention here, okay? And the women were all told to go and sit in the gallery, and were reminded that even though they had been invited because they were such gifted speakers in William Lloyd Garrison's society, they were not going to be allowed to open their mouths and speak at this convention. And these two particular women were pretty upset about that. They arrived at the convention with the expectation that they would be allowed to speak. They were gifted speakers. People came from miles around to hear them speak. And at the convention, they found out that they were not going to be allowed to speak because they were women. So Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and several other people began to find new societies to participate in specifically that would allow them to be activists. The temperance movement, obviously a lot of women became involved in the temperance movement. This is a propaganda picture here. This is fearful quarrels and brutal violence are the natural consequences of the frequent use of the bottle, is what that says underneath that picture there. Alcoholism causing domestic violence was one of the war cries of women at that time. I kind of think it still is. A lot of times people, you know, use that in pop culture and references and stuff like that. Somebody appearing drunk on the stage, on the screen, you automatically assume there's going to be violence eventually. But they put out women on the battlefield, women on the front lines of fighting against the influence of whiskey and rum and gin. They also went on sort of a campaign about the fact that women, because they were women, were paid less than men for everything that they did. The same men and women were both working in those textile mills, those factories that we saw. Men and women were doing exactly the same job, but women were paid less to do them. And at the time, people fighting against that were trying to prove that, you know, it's literally the same amount of work because it's a machine that you man. So it's not like men who were, that if a man was stronger, he could do more work. It was physically impossible to do more than they were already doing because they were machines, and that's how they ran. The Brook Farm experiment in 1841 was an experiment in which a large agricultural venture tried to pay the same to men and women to do work, and it went bankrupt. So we still have a pay disparity in a lot of fields, but let's not talk about that just yet. So Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and 3 other women got together and planned a convention to discuss the social, civil, and religious condition and rights of women. They met to discuss when the convention was going to be on July 9th. Lucretia Mott, her sister, Martha Coffin Wright, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her sister, and 2 other women, including a woman named Jane Hunt, got together and had tea at Jane Hunt's house because Jane Hunt had just given birth the week before and didn't feel good leaving her house, so that's why they had it there. On July 9th, that they were going to have a convention on July 19th. They only had 1 week to get news out about this convention. It was going to be a 2-day convention, July 19th and July 20th. The 19th, only women were going to be invited, and on the 20th, women and men would be allowed to attend. And they sat down and they wrote out the Declaration of Sentiments, and then they edited it, and then they edited it again, and then they continued to edit it. With the plan that would be what they did at the convention, is read this declaration, make everybody agree to it, make everybody sign it, and then present it to the White House. That was the whole point of the convention. When they arrived at the convention site, Elizabeth Cady Stanton had taken the declaration and she had edited it and changed it. And at the last minute, she added Resolution 9, which I'll talk about in a minute, which was the first time that anybody ever suggested that women should have the right to vote. Up until that point, nobody had ever even suggested that. I mean, women should right to own property, sure, right to have their own lawsuits, sure, maybe even pursue an education up until they're married, and maybe after they're married, we haven't decided yet. But the idea that women should be allowed to have their own vote, that you know, in a household with a husband and wife, that the two of them should each be allowed to vote, was something that was so unheard of that Elizabeth Cady Stanton's own husband said, if you're going to put that in there, I can't come to this convention. I can't be there because I can't be associated with that ridiculousness. That's farcical. Like, you're going to make a laughing stock of all of us if you even put that in there. So outrageous that nobody would ever even consider it. When they arrived at the convention, the doors were locked. The convention was supposed to be at Wesleyan Methodist Chapel, and they arrived and the doors were locked. Since her husband had decided not to come, she had brought her sister instead. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and brought her sister instead, and her sister had to bring her son with her because she didn't have anybody to watch him. So they lifted him up and made him climb through a second-story window so that he could unlock the door so they could actually have the convention. So obviously there were some planning snafus in this. But they came in, they started the convention, and they read the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments starts off with, and they did this on purpose. Oh, and I was going to pull that document up. Wonder how hard that would be. Oh, well, it doesn't matter. The Declaration of Sentiments starts with the Declaration of Independence on purpose. Elizabeth Cady Stanton thought it would be a good idea to rewrite the Declaration of Independence the way she felt it should have been written to begin with, to include women in it, okay? Specifically, to include women in the part of the language that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, okay? And then from there, it is a series of just like the Declaration of Independence, it's a series of the wrongs that have been done. You know what, I'm gonna pull up, well, can I don't know. Give me a second, I'm gonna see if I can get to it without breaking something. It shouldn't take me too long, but let me get this sentiment open. Oh, you know what? It'll be easier if I do it like this. Just a minute, Zoom. I'll get to you in a second. Okay. All right, we're going to go into the Declaration of Sentiments. NPS.org. Okay. Come on. Okay, so after we hold these, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people. So right off the bat, it's slightly different from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal. And then just like the Declaration of Independence, it goes into a list of all of the ways that the party has been wronged, okay? Remember, the Declaration of Independence starts with, we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is how the king has screwed that up, and this is why we're declaring our independence. So the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man towards woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let the facts be submitted to a candid world. And this is the list of things that man has done wrong to women. I don't know how well you can see this from where you are. He has made her, if married, in the eye of the law, civilly dead. That's an interesting phrase, civilly dead. What does that mean? What do y'all think about that phrase? Yeah? Well, she can do things. She can have children. She can run a household, right? So what does civilly dead actually mean?
Societally dead.
Right, how so?
Friends may abandon them. Their parents or relatives may look at them differently or even just disown them.
Mm-hmm. But it's the goal of women in this era to be married, isn't it? I mean, if the goal, the end goal of everything, all of the training that you receive, finishing school, etiquette training, all of that is so that you can become married. And then you become civilly dead. So anyway, the Declaration of Sentiments is this long document in which they basically air their grievances. The Declaration of Sentiments is a document that was signed by everybody by 100 people that were there at the convention. Let me get back into my PowerPoint now. First slide. There we go. Okay. And then they adopted 10 resolutions, and the resolutions were resolutions about equal pay, and then they discussed them each in detail. When they brought up the equal pay, somebody stood up and said, it's important that you know that yesterday, this was in the middle of the convention, yesterday, New York State Assembly passed the Married Women's Property Act, which allowed that women can keep the property that they bring into a marriage as their own, and then any property that they earn while married becomes their own, continues to be their own. And New York passed that law, and then New Jersey immediately passed one exactly like it. And then through the states, especially up in the north, states passed laws protecting the property of women. Okay, so they brought that up at the convention and said, we have good news about that. That's actually already in the process of being changed. And everybody went, yay. But this biggest debate happened over resolution number 9. The duty of the women of this country to secure to themselves the sacred right to the elective franchise. As soon as the right to vote came up, and this was the resolution, there were 10 resolutions. Elizabeth Cady Stanton added one. She added resolution 9, and so then there became 11 resolutions. Most of the women gathered there said that that was a mistake. Lucretia Mott hated the idea. Their husbands both really hated it. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton said, if we don't start talking about it now, it's never going to happen. So we need to bring it up. And there were people at the convention that were religious leaders in the community. There were men at the convention who were legislative leaders, and nobody had anything to say out loud against this. But people did get up and leave. And then on Sunday, this was Friday and a Saturday, on Sunday morning from the pulpit, many religious leaders cried out against this convention for specifically this reason, because she said women should be allowed to vote. One person that stood up and definitely spoke in support of it is this guy right here. Do you guys know who this is? Frederick Douglass. Yes, Frederick Douglass, who was at the convention, got up and spoke very eloquently in support of Resolution 9. He got up and spoke very eloquently that women should have the right to vote, and that there was never going to be a future in which African men had the right to vote if women were not also able to, and he wouldn't want it that way. He wouldn't want African men to be able to vote and women not to be able to. He believed that each person had their own individual right to determine who represented them. Okay, he agreed with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and he spoke very furiously in support of her. And as a result, Lucretia Mott was able to get up and speak for about an hour about why she believed that the whole declaration was valuable, even though she sort of disagreed with Resolution 9. And so the whole declaration passed and was signed. 2 weeks later in Rochester, New York, a second women's convention kicked off that did basically the same thing. They took the Declaration of Sentiments, they made it their document, and they discussed all of the future of women's rights in the country. And then there was one in Pennsylvania, and then there was one in Rochester, New York, and then Pennsylvania, and then Charleston, South Carolina, which is a big deal because now we're getting into the South. But it started this ripple movement of conventions in which people were actually talking about the rights of women. Shortly thereafter, Cady Stanton made a new friend, Susan B. Anthony. Y'all heard that name, right? Susan B. Anthony, familiar name? What do you know about her? Anybody right off the bat, what do you know about Susan B. Anthony?
She's on the dollar coin.
She is on the dollar coin, that's correct. Here she is on the dollar coin. Why is she on the dollar coin? Anybody know? Susan B. Anthony was probably the largest force for women's suffrage. We'll have to go pretty far into the future. This class only goes up to 1866 or 1867 or so. In the 1870s, Susan B. Anthony is going to be arrested for trying to vote. And her arrest is going to kick off this like protest movement that's going to get women arrested and eventually is going to get women the right to vote, but not in her lifetime. Okay, one of the reasons we talk about Susan B. Anthony lately is because it has come to the attention of this generation that Susan B. Anthony did something. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but mostly Susan B. Anthony, did something that was a little shady, which was when the 15th Amendment was being debated, right after the Civil War, when the 15th Amendment was being debated, Susan B. Anthony came out against it. Does anybody know what the 15th Amendment says? I know I don't get the numbers straight either. I'm not good with the numbers.
Which amendment?
The 15th Amendment.
Wasn't that African Americans can vote, but their votes are like not as like much as the others, like they're 3/5?
No, the 3/5 compromise was way back in the beginning in the first establishment of the Constitution. The 15th Amendment made it illegal to stop a man from voting based on his race. So according to the 15th Amendment, everybody has a right to vote regardless of their race. Okay, so this is after the Civil War, after the end of slavery, and the 15th Amendment passed under the protest of Susan B. Anthony because she didn't believe that African men should have the right to vote before women did. She believed that women should have the right to vote first, and that if they came out in favor of the 15th Amendment, they would lose traction when it came to giving women the right to vote. So there was a big split in the women's rights movement between people who believed that women should have the right, white women should have the right to vote before black men, and people who believed that both fights could happen simultaneously and there was no need to sacrifice one for the other. And Susan B. Anthony came back on the wrong side of that, basically, because she believed then. And what ultimately ends up happening is that women don't get the right to vote before African men do. African men are given the right to vote before white women of any color are. Women, did anybody know when women get the right to vote? We just celebrated the anniversary. No?
The 19th Amendment?
Right, but what year?
1906?
No, wouldn't that have been nice? No, we just celebrated the anniversary. It was 1920. So all of this, and we're talking about 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. They're not going to actually get women the right to vote until 1920, which means that Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, none of them are going to see it in their lifetime. Okay, it actually took until 1920 for women to have the right to vote. But this movement kicked off a lot of heroes that we're going to look at. Sojourner Truth is a Methodist pastor. She was from the African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she spoke at many of these conventions, specifically for the right of women. This is a famous quote of hers: "Look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman?" The idea that women were somehow weaker than men was laughable to Sojourner Truth. She thought that was insane. And she spoke often about the strength and abilities of women. Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman to become the first female physician. She was able to enter medical training and then able to enter medical school. And she got graduated and then found out that nobody would let her practice until she moved to New York, and until that passage of that act that said that women could keep the property that they had. And then she was able to open a practice in New York. I think it's New York. I'd have to look that up. But you don't have to, because I'm not going to test you on it. These are things that happen after this class ends. So these are things that happen going forward, peeking into the future here. Victoria Woodhull is the first woman to petition Congress directly for the right to vote. She goes to Congress and files a petition and actually spoke in front of Congress. But probably one of my favorite people that comes out of this movement is Amelia Bloomer, who invented the bloomers. Now, why is this such a revolutionary idea? I don't know. But the idea is that women have more freedom of movement if they're wearing pants, but pants are frowned upon. So let's design pants that look a lot like skirts. And we'll call them freedom freedom skirts because you can ride a horse, you can walk and run and not worry about getting your skirts up out of the way. And for some reason, this kicks off an entire movement called bloomerism. It's focused on clothing for some reason. So I want us to take a look at this cartoon. I posted it on Blackboard where you could get to it, and your assignment for today comes from this cartoon. There's a lot of this is an anti-bloomerism cartoon. Okay, because bloomerism became not just about the pants, it becomes about the women who wear them. Anybody who would choose to wear bloomers is a certain type of woman. In this generation, we would call it an SJW. Anybody who would choose to wear bloomers is obviously a social justice warrior of her time. And therefore, they have no respect for society and no respect for decency or ladylike behavior. And this cartoon kind of sums all of that up. So your homework assignment for tonight is going to be basically to write about what you see in this cartoon and how it reflects why bloomerism is bad. Okay? Okay, so here's that assignment on Blackboard. Let me see if I can get to it without killing myself. Class materials. I can't. I wish I could do this two-handed. Okay. I cannot. Okay. We're in section 2, building the nation. And we are in week 10, romanticism. Okay, so here's the cartoon where you should be able to see it. There's the cartoon, and here's the assignment. Do an internet search for, find out what bloomers are and why bloomerism is such a scandal in the early 1800s. Take a look at the cartoon. What elements has the artist included to introduce or to indicate how bloomer wearers are controversial figures? What is the overall attitude of the onlookers? Take about 100 words to describe what you see in this cartoon and how it reflects how people felt about women who fought for women's rights. Okay? Any questions? All right, we're only finishing 5 minutes early. That's pretty surprising. Any questions from Zoom? Y'all doing okay?